Hey everybody, welcome to The Thoughtful Bro, live streaming to you as always on Tuesdays on A Mighty Blaze. We have an amazing show for you today. I've been hearing that from almost everybody that I've ever met. You guys have been blowing up my phone. I'm very excited for this interview with Maggie O'Farrell to talk about HAMNET. A few things first, for those of you who don't know A Mighty Blaze, of course, we are here as a collection of authors and folks in the publishing industry who got together at the beginning of COVID to help out other authors who are getting their books published and kind of can't do a real life book tour. So we have been bringing you every week. We bring about a half a dozen new interviews. You can check out in our library some of the ones we've done lately. It's an amazing list, just to name a few recent ones: Tom Perrotta, Danny Shapiro, Anna Quinlan, Anne Lamott, Jess Walters, Erica Jong, Cheryl Strayed, Edwidge Danticat, and Pam Houston. Again, if you just go to the Facebook page of A Mighty Blaze or our YouTube page, you can see it all there. We don't ask you guys for anything. We're an all-volunteer organization. All we ask is that you like us and follow us on social media, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. And again, you can watch these interviews live or just check them out in our library after they happen. If you guys have any questions for Maggie today, as usual, just pop them in the Facebook comments and they will make their way to me. I already have like 9 audience questions, and that's like many people had multiple questions. And so 9 isn't even the real number. It's just, it seems like, I was saying to Maggie just before we got on that clearly she struck on something incredible with this book. The response kind of from the audience just announcing this interview was terrific. So anyway, I want to give a brief introduction to Maggie and then we'll get right to it. Maggie O'Farrell is the author of the Sunday Times #1 best-selling memoir, I Am. She's written 8 novels, including The Distance Between Us, The Hand That First Held Mine, Instructions for a Heat Wave, This Must Be the Place, and now HAMNET. HAMNET, if you haven't heard already, is taking the literary world by storm. It's a New York Times bestseller, a New York Times Best 10 Books of the Year, a New York Public Library Best Book of the Year, and the list just kind of grows day by day. The Washington Post called HAMNET miraculous and brilliant. NPR called it a tour de force, and the Boston Globe called it gorgeous, magnificent, and searing. The Globe reviewer actually went on to say, quote, "I nearly drowned at the end of this book." And nearly every person who interviews Maggie confesses that they cried at the end of the book. I'm not making a comment about myself, but the ending was remarkable. And Maggie is joining us now live from Edinburgh. We're so happy to have her here. Maggie, welcome to Mighty Blaze and welcome to The Thoughtful Bro.
Thank you so much. It's very nice to see you all. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you got it. You got it. All right. So before we get going, can you just hold up the book? I think you have the British version.
I've got a UK edition. Yeah, I do have an American one, but it's in the basement and it's too dark to go down. I'm too scared to go down to the basement to get it.
Yes. So folks, that is the UK version of HAMNET. The US version has an awesome cover really with a feather over the eyes.
With a quill across his eyes. Yeah.
Quill, yeah, it's just beautiful. So we're gonna put the link to how to buy that. Please just go buy it now. It's the holiday season. Just buy a few for yourself, for your friends. Figure out who you give them to later. It's sort of, I was thinking to myself, it's just buying HAMNET for a friend is sort of like what they used to say about stock traders. Like, nobody gets fired for buying IBM. Like, if you get HAMNET as a gift, nobody's gonna, get you in trouble. So just go ahead, do it. You won't regret it. All right, so Maggie, I love this book. I finished it a few nights ago. I thought it was not only just this incredible historical story and drama about one of the most famous people in history, but it was also worked in a different level as like a kind of theory of why Hamlet was the remarkable piece of literature that it is. I mean, so you have both a great historical drama in its own right, and also just a very interesting and I find completely persuasive point of view about how one of the greatest works of literature was ever written. This book is just firing on all cylinders, but why don't you just start us off, just tell us what the book's about.
Well, for me, I think the engine that always powered the book for me was that I've always felt that HAMNET, the real Hamlet Shakespeare, has never been really given his due. He's never been given the significance, I think, that he deserves, and his early death. I first heard about him when I was, I think I was about 16, and I was studying the play Hamlet for my exams in Scotland. And my teacher mentioned in passing that Shakespeare had a son who was called HAMNET, who died several years before the play is dated anyway. People think that the play, the Globe Theatre anyway, dates it as 1601. And I decided to take them. I thought they're pretty expert in the matter. And it's just always felt to me that he's not well known enough, the boy. And, I've just always felt that he's kind of been reduced to a literary footnote. And I think he's much more significant than he is. If you read those big sort of 500-page chunky biographies of Shakespeare written by scholars or academics, I mean, brilliantly written, brilliantly researched, every single stone in the whole kind of oeuvre of Shakespeare has been turned over and examined. But at the same time, Hamnet, the boy, is lucky if he gets maybe 2 mentions in the back of the book. They mention that he was born and they mention that he's died. And then his death is always wrapped up in statistics about the high rate of child mortality in the 16th century, almost as if the implication is that it wasn't really that big of a deal because people expected kids to die. And I've always been skewered through the heart by this thought, because I think he was 11, of course he was grieved. And you only have to read the opening scenes of the play Hamlet with those lenses in front of your eyes to realize that, yes, he was grieved, that he left an enormous chasm of grief behind him. So that's really why I wanted to write the book. I just wanted to say, this boy was important. I wanted to give him a voice and a body, and to say this child's life was so significant. Without him, we wouldn't have Hamlet. We probably wouldn't have Twelfth Night.
Yeah, so I think one of the best things about the book is it's not just the story and the kind of literary case that you make about Hamlet, but also just the language itself and the writing, which is just so vivid, so central. And I was just hoping that, could you just read us maybe a page or two and give us the flavor of that?
So I'll read right from the beginning, actually, because I thought we'd give Hamlet a voice. That's what the book has done. This is right at the beginning, where Hamlet is looking for a grown-up because his twin sister Judith has fallen ill, and he's come across his grandfather, who's a rather erratic character. "Do you know where everyone's gone?" Hamlet asks. "Eh?" his grandfather says, mopping at his papers. His anger at their spoiling seems to unsheath itself and stretch out from him like a rapier. Hamlet can feel the tip of it wander about the room, seeking an opponent. "Don't stand there gulping," his grandfather hisses. "Help me." Hamlet shuffles forward a step, then another. He is wary, his father's words circling in his mind. Stay away from your grandfather when he's in one of his black humours. Be sure to stand clear of him. Stay well back, do you hear? Hamlet believes he is keeping his word. He is at the other side of the fireplace. His grandfather couldn't reach him here, even if he tried. His grandfather is draining his cup with one hand and shaking the drops off a sheet of paper with the other. "Take this," he orders, holding out the page. Hamlet bends forward, not moving his feet, and it takes it with the very tips of his fingers. His grandfather's eyes are slitted, watchful. His tongue pokes out of the side of his mouth. He sits in a chair, hunched, an old, sad toad on a stone. "And this?" His grandfather holds out another paper. Hamlet bends forward in the same way, keeping the necessary distance. He thinks of his father, how he would be proud of him, how he would be pleased. Quick as a fox, his grandfather makes a lunge. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, the prose experience of this book is just so lush, and it's kind of worth reading for that alone. But so let's just talk about one aspect of this book that was interesting to me. So, this is, I have noticed, and certainly this is not some brilliant insight by me, but like there are a lot of books that do so well about the kind of family lives or the life of the partner of some kind of famous man, like a Hemingway. There's like The Paris Wife. There's Z, about Zelda Fitzgerald. There's a great book by an author named Whitney Scherer about called Age of Light, about Man Ray and Lee Miller, his partner. And I wanted to think, and this seems like the biggest of them all, and also oddly kind of the most obscure because there's so little known about Shakespeare. But I'm just wondering, like, could you just say, like, why is this such a reliable area of interest for readers? Why do readers kind of love these kinds of books so much?
Well, I think all readers understand that it's a fictional construct. Obviously the people in my book are based on the really scant facts that we know about Shakespeare and his family. And I think, obviously readers understand that, this is fiction that I made up and other writers make it up. But I suppose it's I suppose these characters, these people, as they were, are interesting to us. And I mean, I was particularly fascinated by this boy who just dropped out of sight, who nobody really knows. No, his name isn't anywhere near well known enough, I think. And, and Shakespeare is such a mysterious character. I mean, if you mentioned those other, artists and writers, and, we know, compared to Shakespeare, we know so much more about them than we do about him. I mean, there's only 6 examples of Shakespeare's signature in existence, and there are huge gaps in his story and in his narrative. Scholars refer to the lost years, which means the years between he was, being a sort of grammar school boy, age 15 in Stratford, and then suddenly appearing on the stage in London so almost a decade later. And that's extraordinary. Nobody, even given the best efforts of the world's best scholars, has been able to join those dots. Nobody's ever been able to explain how that happened and how this could have happened. So that, there are fascinating gaps in his narrative. And I think as a novelist, I found those a real opportunity, because there were kind of quite sort of a lot of vacancies that I could fill with my own ideas and theories, in a sense.
Yeah. And let's talk about that. I want to keep going on that, because I think the identity of Shakespeare is one of just the most tantalizing mysteries in kind of the history of the arts, really. And I just want to set the stage for a moment, just so people get an idea. So this is Shakespeare's writing in the 1590s and early 1600s mostly. And this is a time, Don Quixote was published, I think, in 1605. Around the same year as King Lear, which was probably the greatest year in literary history. And there's other Elizabethan playwrights. There's Ben Jonson, there's Chris Marlowe, and comparatively, so much is known about these contemporaries of Shakespeare. And it wasn't a secret that Shakespeare was a big success in his life. He was basically a multimillionaire. He owned a lot of land. It wasn't like he was a posthumously discovered kind of author. So just part of it is that it's tantalizing that there's nothing is known, but then the question is why? What is it? Does it say something about Shakespeare that he would not just say, write down 10 pages about his life for posterity or something? What do you take from the fact that so little is known about this man who could have written something about himself or secured a legacy in that way?
I mean, I think one of the things one of the many things actually that fascinated me when I was researching the book, and this doesn't appear in the book, of course, because it doesn't fit in the time frame of the novel, but is the fact that, you mentioned Marlowe and Jonson, and they were both university educated men, which Shakespeare wasn't. Shakespeare had a grammar school education, probably up to around the age of 15. And that in itself is astonishing. How did this boy who had so little education comparatively to those two, how did he write, the best plays ever written, some of the best poetry ever written? But also, Jonson and Marlowe, they made sure that their work was preserved for posterity. So before they died, between their retirement and their death, they printed copies of their own plays that would, so they would exist for history. Shakespeare did not do that. I mean, he had a pretty long and quite relaxed, I would imagine, retirement back in Stratford after he left the stage. But he showed no interest, no inclination to do that. And that fascinates me, because that raises the question, was he not aware of the value of his own work? Was he not aware of its gift to the world? Did he not know how good he was? That fascinates me. And I wonder whether people in Stratford knew him better as maybe a landlord than perhaps a player or a playwright, because he did, like you say, at the end of his career, he was the equivalent of a multimillionaire. He was a very good businessman, unlike his father, who was not a good businessman. But he, all the money he had, he invested back in Stratford. He bought fields and cottages and land that he leased out. So I wonder whether people actually maybe didn't realize in Stratford that he was a genius, let's say. So that fascinates me. But again, with Shakespeare, there's so many, you could spend the whole of your life reading about Shakespeare, but at the end, there are still so many question marks that hover over his life and over his work. So who knows?
I mean, I have to ask, do you have a position on, did Shakespeare write his plays?
I mean, the weird thing about Shakespeare is I think it's possibly created by all these strange vacancies in his story. I mean, one of the theories that I've read, it's possible, again, who knows, is that he must have had an extensive library, because he shows incredible knowledge of all sorts of literature and all sorts of sources. And one of the theories is that all his libraries and his papers were in London and were possibly destroyed in the Great Fire, which is plot. I mean, it fits historically, who knows? And, and to the best, despite the best efforts, nobody's ever been able to uncover his letters and his library and quite a lot of the manuscripts. No one's ever found them. I mean, it's only thanks to his two colleagues and friends, Hemmings and Condell, that we have his plays, because they printed them and published them, put them together, cleaned them up. They got all the foul papers of the, of the of the playhouses, and got them together and gave us what was now known as the first folio. And that's the only reason we have his plays. But as to the theory about who wrote them, I mean, there's so many theories that kind of zing around about Shakespeare, from who wrote the plays to, did he go to sea? Was he a sailor? Was he a legal clerk? Was he gay? Was he straight? All these kind of anything. You can almost sort of, in a sense, his sort of legacy is almost one of quite plasticity. You can almost sort of squeeze him into whatever theory you perhaps want to apply to him. I don't know. I mean, I think I would say about that particular theory is it's not one that particularly interests me. I mean, who knows? I don't know. I mean, there are so many arguments for it and so many arguments against it. I think he did write them. I think he did, because why would his friends have put them together if he didn't write them? I don't really understand what would be their reason for doing that. I don't know. I think he did. I'm going to put it out there, but I'm sure there are lots of people who would argue against it. I think with Shakespeare, you can do that endlessly.
I mean, I'm not a scholar myself, but I just feel like it always just has a little bit of snobbery around it, this idea that he couldn't have written it, it's been so precocious. I mean, I don't know, just in America, someone like Bob Dylan, I mean, he was writing some of his best songs when he was like 20 years old. I mean, it's just, anyway, but I have to say, it does remind me of like one of my all-time favorite literary jokes, which I'm sure you've heard, which is that everybody knows Shakespeare's plays weren't written by Shakespeare, but by a different man with the same name. It's attributed to like Mark Twain and like a zillion other people, but think about that joke. It's very funny. Okay, so this leads to like the real question that I want to ask you, which is like, so you are dealing with the greatest creator of other characters in history. How do you decide to characterize Shakespeare in your book? And I know maybe this is also a moment where you could talk about how you don't name him and why that is, and just some of the issues you had kind of bringing him onto the page.
Well, I think the biggest issue was vertigo. I was actually very, very nervous writing about him. This is a book I've wanted to write for a really long time. And there were various things that I kept stalling, various reasons I kept stalling and kept slightly putting off. One of which was, of course, that it's him, and how could anyone dare really to write about him? How could anyone even approach this icon? I mean, even to say he's an icon sounds a bit sort of facile, really, because he sort of goes beyond that. I mean, to say that he's, the greatest writer that ever lived is true. I mean, most people would agree about that, but it's not as if anyone else ever really comes close. There's not as if there have been many contenders for that crown in all the years that come through. And, everybody has their own version of Shakespeare inside their head. He actually imbues and affects our very language, the words that we use in every day. So many can be attributed to him, and so many phrases. Often we are quoting him without realizing we're quoting him, because he's just become part of our language. So yes, I was very, very nervous about approaching him and using it. And I found that I couldn't write his name in a novel. It just wouldn't work. And I tried various iterations of it. But I found I couldn't sit down at my desk and write a sentence, William Shakespeare sat down and ate bread for breakfast. I just instantly, I felt like a total Egypt. And I got pulled out of the narrative. And I thought, well, if I as the writer can't stay submerged in this narrative, I can't expect readers to. So, and also I think it was partly to do with the fact that he has so many guises, in a sense. And I wanted in a way to ask readers, particularly when I was writing about his early life, he got married when he was 18, which I find really shocking. And my own son is 17 and a half. And sometimes I look at him and I think, wow, 18 is young. 18 is really young. I hope my son's not going to get married in 6 months. So, I wanted to kind of imagine who he was before he was who he became, if you see what I mean. That's a very convoluted sentence, but, to see him as, almost in a sense he must have been extraordinary even at that age. He must have stuck out like a sore thumb at grammar school. Imagine being his Latin teacher or his rhetoric teacher or his Greek teacher. And that mind, which has never, ever found its parallel or found its equal, he must have been extraordinary even as a teenager. So I wanted to ask people to see that. It's funny, I used to teach actually a long time ago. I used to teach, I taught creative writing in university, but I also taught high school English when I lived in Hong Kong. And I remember teenagers then saying to me, I hate Shakespeare, I don't see the point of it. And I said to them, he got married at 18. I said, you've got to try and imagine he was a person, he was a real person. He was really young and he wanted to be a player, and I think to kind of think of him as a person rather than this playwright. You know, I mean, I know the only sort of portraits we have of him, he's quite a middle-aged man, but you know, he was quite rebellious, I think. I mean, he got married, he had to have a special license to get married. His bride was pregnant. You know, I mean, obviously you can tell by his plays that he's a man of many passions, let's say.
Yeah. And I think another aspect, along with all that you just said, another aspect that's brought up, which is so interesting, is this sort of like seeing Shakespeare as he is seen by people in his town as a kind of ne'er-do-well, a kind of like what he doesn't even have a profession, you know, like how is this guy going to end up? And then there's this awesome scene where he leaves for London for the first time and he says to his wife, "What if I fail?" And like this scene of like Shakespeare of all people saying, "What if I fail?" and doubting himself in that way. I mean, there's many scenes like that in the book, which just are terrific, I thought.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I suppose what I'm asking readers to do is to forget everything they think they know about him and just try to see him as a man, as a character. You know, that's why I always call him the brother or the father or the Latin tutor, or, you know, I wanted to kind of, in a sense, I wanted to separate him from his name, from the iconography that is him and that his surname means to us all, to try and get readers to forget that and try to see him just as a human being.
Right. Okay, so now let's move on to like really what's the heart of the book, which is Agnes. I mean, am I pronouncing it correct? Is it Agnes?
Yeah, I mean, I usually say Agnes to myself just because we can start to sound very French and pretentious otherwise. But it's fine. Agnes. Agnes is fine. I think that's how it would have been pronounced in Elizabethan times.
Okay, well, Agnes, what's in a name? Agnes, she is the wife of Shakespeare, known to history, I think, as Anne Hathaway, but you call her Agnes here. But let's talk first about her bad reputation. She historically has gotten this bad reputation, which, I mean, if there's like very little known about Shakespeare, how much less is known about his wife? And yet there seems to be this kind of historical universal consensus that it was a bad marriage and she was kind of a manipulative older woman and all this stuff. And it just seems to be based on nothing. And that is not at all the portrait that you paint here. So, but first of all, why does she have that reputation?
Well, it's really interested me and infuriated me in equal measure, you know, because when I originally conceived the book, I thought it was going to be about fathers and sons, and it was going to be a ghost story as the place to sort of mirror the play. But actually what happened when I was researching for the book, I became totally incensed, actually, by the way that the woman we are taught to know as Anne Hathaway has been treated over the intervening, 400, 500 years. We are, like you say, we've been fed this whole narrative about her right from the start, that she was this older woman, she'd seduced this younger genius boy into marriage, she'd got herself pregnant, and people have kind of blamed her for that as if it's an act that women can achieve on their own. There's no one else involved in that. We're told that he hated her, that she was ugly, that he had to go to London to run away from her. I mean, there's nothing, I have found nothing, and I've read as many books as I could possibly get my hands on. There's nothing to substantiate these theories. And people will always throw out the behest in the will, the famous second best bed. But if you actually look at the will, it is a very strange and very dry document. I mean, the man was dying, for God's sake, probably of typhoid, which is a particularly unpleasant death. But actually, it's completely devoid of any emotion for anyone. Any of the behests he gives, they're all very emotionless. I mean, he was probably dictating it. I don't think it's in his handwriting, but the second best bed is an interlineation. It's squeezed in between two other lines. And also in Jacobean law, she was entitled to a third of his estate anyway. So it wasn't as if she was turfed out on the street with a bed. I think that people are always so determined. But, if people say to me, oh, what about the second best bed? I'll say, well, I'll raise you to second best bed. And I will say to you, at the end of his career, he was, as we said, a multimillionaire. He could have lived anywhere he wanted, but he chose to go back to Stratford to live his retirement with her. And that doesn't, to me, suggest a man who regretted his marriage and hated his wife. And he also, as we've also said, he sent all his money back. He lived in really modest lodgings, the kind of lodgings that a student would have lived in London. Again, he didn't settle, he didn't put down roots necessarily in London. He sent everything back to Stratford. And a year after Hamnet died, he bought his wife and two daughters an absolute mansion of a place in Stratford upon Avon. So, I mean, that to me shows me that his heart was there. So I just got really infuriated by it and by how she's been treated. And I mean, the idea that she's ugly, people often say she was ugly, which is, again, is extraordinary because There's one portrait of her in existence, and it was drawn 80 years after she died, but people think it's been taken from a contemporary sketch. And in it, she's beautiful. She actually looks very like the actress Saoirse Ronan. She's got that very sort of narrow face with high cheekbones. So yeah, I don't know why. And it's always baffled me as to why we are taught this very sort of misogynistic story about her, this very horrible narrative about her. You know, I don't know why it is that scholars and biographers and other, screenplay writers of Oscar-winning films and other novelists actually are determined to give him a retrospective divorce. You know, why is it we are so keen to have him footloose and fancy-free in London? I mean, I think they want him to live this other life, but I actually don't think that is true. I'm not saying, who knows? I don't know what he was up to in London. I suspect he probably had quite a lot of fun, but shall we say, but I think his heart was back in Stratford. I do. I mean, that's where everything, his compass seems to point there all the time.
Yeah, and I love this kind of loving marriage that you portray. I mean, he is, I think, suspected of infidelity, but that's not like at the middle of the book or even really appearing in the book at all, other than some suspicions. Overall, it's a real portrait of love that you paint between these two, and I found that, frankly, quite refreshing. But I guess, so just kind of same question here as I had for the Bard, which is that in the absence of almost any documents or contemporaneous portraits, how do you characterize? How did you create such a fascinating character here of Agnes?
Well, actually, yeah, to say that, there's very few documents about Shakespeare. He left a very scant paper trail himself, but there's even less for her. There's almost nothing. Her birth isn't even recorded because she was born before parish records began. So I think there were several things that I drew on for her. One of the documents I read was her father's will. Her father was Richard Hathaway, quite a well-to-do sheep farmer, and he died a year before she married William. And I read his will, and in it he leaves her quite a generous dowry, and in it he refers to her as my daughter Agnes. And this was a kind of lightning bolt moment for me, because I thought, well, surely if anyone knows her real name, it's going to be her dad,
right,
who presumably had a hand in giving it to her. And I thought, on top of everything else, have we been calling her by the wrong name for almost half a century? Because spelling in Elizabethan times was not very stable, just as in HAMNET and HAMLET are interchangeable in parish records. You can see, and it would have been pronounced Agnes or Anis at the time. So you can see why people would have maybe shortened it, or a scribe or a parish clerk might have got it wrong. But her father calls her Agnes. So I decided to give this name back to her. And I suppose I was thinking about it. You have to be obviously very careful or very sort of circumspect about reading too much or extrapolating too much from his work about his life. But, his plays are populated by an extraordinary number of beloved, faithful, constant, loved wives. And, I was thinking about the marriage of true minds line, and I wanted to say to readers, you've got to try to put aside this narrative about the aging peasant strumpet who lured this boy into marriage. And, people have said she was illiterate and stupid, but she probably was illiterate, because what daughter of a sheep farmer would have been taught to read? But it doesn't really even need stating that illiteracy is not necessarily stupidity. It doesn't need to be said, so I found that very frustrating. And I think I went back to the plays, and I was reading Hamlet again, and I was very struck by, obviously one of the things that is extraordinary about Shakespeare's writing is the kind of reach and fetch of the range of his metaphors and the range of his knowledge on a vast number of subjects. And in Hamlet, there's an awful lot of references to herbology, and very informed references to herbology, particularly in the scene with the mad Ophelia, and she hands out plants to people, and all those plants are a very specific cure for a character flaw she sees in that person. So I decided to give that expertise to her, because I thought it would be the idea that there's a kind of partnership between them, and there's a sort of mutual flow of information and adoration actually as well. And the other thing that I've always fascinated in Shakespeare is that he shows a lot of expertise in falconry or hawking. So again, I decided to give this to her. And so for her, I did a lot of, obviously the whole book required quite a lot of library-based research, but for Agnes in particular, and some of the other female characters in the book, I did a lot more physical research. I really wanted to get my hands dirty in a sense. So I did cultivate and plant my own Elizabethan medicinal garden. because I really wanted to understand the labor involved in that task, because every household would have had one, and every woman of the house would have had a kind of basic knowledge into how to treat sort of common ailments, how to treat her own children, her own household. So I did that. And I also learned how to fly a kestrel. I went down to the Scottish borders to a wood and I flew a kestrel, which was actually the most fun thing I've ever done in the name of research for a book.
Wait, I don't even know what that is. You flew a what?
Kestrel, a hawk. Sorry,
oh,
falcon.
Really?
Yeah, it's a little very small falcon about that big. Absolutely beautiful. Yeah, so I went hawking. I mean, kestrels are actually falcons, but it's falconry hawking, same thing, really.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, it was very cool. But the funny thing was, I'd already written the scene, and I had described in the scene that the kestrel lands on her glove like with a thud. And then I actually flew a kestrel. I went down to the borders and I met this really cool woman who owned all these hawks and falcons, and she taught me how to do it. But actually, I realized that the kestrel is about the size and weight of a kitten. So you're standing there with your leather glove, and 1 minute it's not there, the next minute it is, and it just arrives with this kind of absolute silence, and it just was sort of a whisper. And so I had to go back and completely rewrite the scene, because I thought there's no thud. It's really not that heavy at all.
Well, I think you probably would have gotten away with that if you had like said there was a thud.
You never know. You can get all this. I always call these letters, I think you'll find letters. People often write and say, no, I think you'll find Ms. O'Farrell.
I think you'll find.
So I don't want to get any hawking experts sending me cross letters.
Oh my gosh. Well, look, I mean, I think, so the gardening thing, I mean, I understand that more than falconry. I mean, I don't have a garden, but I would just, one of the things that I think I've always loved about Shakespeare, and this is certainly something that's often said about Shakespeare, is the kind of the earthiness of it. It's just so full of the senses, every sense is just on every page. And I think that is also in your work. It's just such a central kind of earthy book. And so that gardening thing makes sense to me, because it's just that is really coming through as palpable in the work.
Well, I think I was just trying to imagine what life would have been like, in rural Warwickshire. And I think they would have been a lot closer to the natural world than we are, necessarily so, because that's how they made a living, particularly Agnes, who grew up on a sheep farm. So I think their connection with nature and the natural rhythms would have been a lot closer than ours is today.
Yeah. Okay, just a few more questions, but one of them, before we move off Agnes, because frankly, she is, the center of this book. Look, you've said in other interviews that you're a mother yourself, and you said a child dying is your worst nightmare, as it would be mine as a parent. And yet you chose to write this book and kind of live in that space. And I know that the grief scenes in this book have been praised just universally. And I guess my question to you is just, how was that? Like, why did you want to do that? How was that for you to kind of basically day in, day out creating this work, contemplate your worst nightmare?
Well, I think it was, I do remember writing the first two-thirds of the book and knowing that the scene that I was dreading was getting closer and closer. And I do remember the weeks sort of leading up to it and realizing that it was about to come and I was going to have to do the deed. And I kept going back to the beginning thinking, I just need to fix the beginning. I just need to fix the and I put it off for as long as I possibly could. And then I had to, and I was looking back in my diary, because I keep a diary every day, not as in appointments, as other things that are going on. I think Americans call it a journal. And I was looking for something else entirely about that year. And I just came across this completely blank, open double page. And it just said, I killed Hamnet today. But I think I think it goes back to what I was saying about the engine that was powering the book for me. I wanted his death to be a very significant event. I wanted it to feel awful, because I think it was, and I think I felt a great responsibility to the real Hamnet, actually, not so much my fictional one, but the real boy who is buried somewhere in that churchyard in Stratford-upon-Avon. We don't know where, because he doesn't have a gravestone, but he's there somewhere, we know that. And I felt a real responsibility to that real child. And I wanted to say, I suppose, the book in itself, particularly in those scenes where he dies and then Agnes has to lay him out for burial, I wanted them, I felt that I had a responsibility, and I wanted to dignify him with how I thought how dreadful his death would have been, because it would have been. He was 11 and he died in high summer, possibly in a plague year. Nobody knows exactly what the real Hamnet Shakespeare died of, because there's no record of death. There's a record of burial, but there's no cause of death recorded. So I wanted to give it as much gravitas and dignity as I possibly could. So they were, in a sense, I think they were the hardest things I've ever written. But and so I had to do them in quite short bursts. I did it in sort of 15, 20-minute bursts, and then I would take a short break. And actually, I found that I couldn't write them in the house. I couldn't write them in the house where my children live. So I didn't write them here in my office. I actually wrote them in the garden. And we had this, we had a shed. It's not a very nice, glamorous shed. It was a really manky old potting shed. It's actually since blown down in a storm. And I sat in there on a kind of old garden chair, and I wrote them in there in 15, 20-minute bursts. And then I would have a break, and then I would go back to the shed. But I wanted them to be hard scenes. They had to be, because it's, it is the most, as I said, it's every parent's most visceral fear. It's the thing we all dread.
Well, I will say that there were so many passages in this book that were just utterly world-class, that just blew me out of the water. But one of my favorites was, you do this amazing thing, and I don't think this is a spoiler, but part of the death scene of Hamnet is delivered from Hamnet, the child's own perspective. And I just thought it was one of the best portrayals of a death I've ever seen. So I was just amazed by that. Okay, so we have like a bunch of questions from the audience, but one more question for me before we get to there, and I'm already skipping over a bunch of the stuff that I wanted to ask you, but I just got to get to the audience questions. But we can't talk about this book without talking about the ending. And I'm not going to give a spoiler away, but it was one of the best endings of a book I've read in years. It totally blew me away. Everybody who reads this book says that. The setting is, actually, I'm going to leave it to you to spoil what you wish to spoil, but here's what I'll say. The climax of the book relates to your kind of interpretation of why Hamlet, the play, was the thing that it was. And I think that, like, literary scholars, there's a lot of agreement that, like, that play was a turning point in Shakespeare's career. It was very different than anything he'd written until that time. It was frankly different than anything that had been ever written by anybody until that time. It was even a lot different than anything that he wrote after that. There's something very unique about that play and the strange, powerful energy in that play. And I think you make an amazing kind of case for, like, why was that? So I guess that's a kind of a blah question, but I just want to turn it over to you to talk about the ending and kind of your theory about the way Hamlet was conceived and written.
Well, I always knew that the book would end where it does. I mean, I think I can say, because it ends with the play. It ends with the play Hamlet, and it ends in the Globe Theatre in London. And I always knew that that's where the book would end up. That's where I wanted it to be, because, Hamnet, the boy, dies roughly halfway through the book, and then there's a section I wanted there to be. I think that the reason for me writing the book is that I wanted to say that this death was important, and this death had an effect on all the family, every single person living in that house in Henley Street, in the whole 3 generations that lived there. But also, more significantly for us anyway, on his father. So many books of scholarship that I've read about it have said something along the lines of, isn't it a strange coincidence that there's a play with almost the same name as the son? Anyway, moving on. And I always think, hang on a second, let's not move on. Let's just sit with that for a minute. I mean, there's no way on earth that Shakespeare would have used essentially his son's name. I mean, I know to us there is a 1-letter difference, but as I said, they are the same name in parish records. There are plenty of Hamnets that were born as Hamnet and buried as Hamlets, and the other way around. There's no way on earth that a playwright would call a character after his dead son. Nobody would take that decision lightly. Nobody would do that lightly. It's an act of enormous significance. I've always felt that, in trying to visualize Shakespeare as a man and as a human being with a pulse, that this is him reaching for us through history to say, this is important. I called this play after my son, my only son, who died. And I think, obviously the name in the play has 3 iterations. There's the play itself, which is called Hamlet, and there's the young prince, who's called Hamlet, and then there is the ghost, the father, who is also called Hamlet. And, I think Shakespeare has taken the plot from a much earlier play. I think it's a Danish play called Amleth, A-M-L-E-T-H. So I think in a way that he often did, he used and adapted and revivified a sort of existing plot. but he called it, he called it the name of his dead son, and I think that can't possibly be passed over. It can't possibly be underestimated, his reasoning for that. And if we do take the date of the play, which is the date that the Globe Theatre gives it, which is 1601, that's 4 years after Hamnet died. And it's strange, I've always felt that it's funny going back to read it, because I studied the play when I was a student, as a teenager, and again when I was a student at university, because I studied literature at uni. And there's all sorts of debate about how old Hamlet, the prince, is. But when I went back to read it more recently, I thought, my God, he's 15. He is. It seems so specific. It's such a specific kind of stage of development, about this boy prince who is sort of dragged too soon into this adult world, and he's pulled into this sort of very confusing world where adults are behaving really badly, actually, and there's all this kind of recent marriage, and which was incestuous in those days, and his father has been murdered, and he's suddenly pulled out of kind of studentship and boyhood into this very confusing world. And it just seemed to me, it just seemed very specifically, and I was thinking, if he's 15, then he's the age that Hamnet would have been. And is that, there's all kinds of theories about it. You could write theories about Hamlet the play forever, but also the idea that the identity of Hamlet is split into two. There's the dead father and there's the alive son. And there is a story, perhaps apocryphal, that Shakespeare himself took the part of the ghost, the dead father, in the first production of Hamlet. And that was just irresistible to me, and it doesn't take a psychiatrist to work out what's going on there, and I know that feeling as a parent, if one of your children is ill or suffering, that the desire is overwhelming for it to be you instead. You want to make some kind of weird sort of a bargaining thing. And you think, if I could have this illness and free them, if I could be in their place, if I could suffer for them, then I would. And just the idea that you would want to do that. So, yeah, I've just always felt that the play is an expression. It is about the boy. It's about the lost son. Obviously, it's about many other things as well, but it's it can't be ignored, the fact that it's the same name.
And as you say, I'm cautious because I don't want to get too enthusiastic and start talking about the end of your book. But I would just say that what you put forward is so convincing. A, B, I haven't heard it before, and as you're saying, because people just seem to gloss over this fact. And C, I just feel like Hamlet has just been analyzed up the wazoo, as we say. And here you are kind of presenting a case about a way to interpret this play that brings freshness to one of the most picked over pieces of literature ever. And for me, I was just I probably read Hamlet 15 times. And it's here it's just sort of as I think you've said this in another interview, that, once you start looking at, I think you might even said it early on in this interview, that once you start looking at it through these eyes of the kind of case you make in The Death of the Son, you kind of can't see it another way. It's supported by the text in the play. So it was just remarkable.
Thank you.
All right, so hey, clearly I like the book. All right, so Maggie, if we could just go 5 minutes over. I know we're almost out of time here, but I want to kind of race through some of these questions and just do your best kind of keeping the answers maybe a little bit short, because I want to ask them all. But so here we go. So this is a question from Caroline. Before Hamnet, she wrote the amazing book, I Am, about her almost dying episodes. Hamnet also is about death. Can you ask Maggie about her worldview in the face of all this sorrow?
At the moment, good.
Quickly.
Quick question. Well, I don't know. And I think what will happen is that we are going to come through it, but I think we'll be different. I think we'll be changed by it. I think, in a sense, it's a bit like anyone who's been through a very serious illness. Illness changes you. You come through it, but you're sort of remade, you're recast, and you come out the other side and you're wiser and you're probably a little bit sadder. And I think as a population, we're going to be the same. I think we will come through this awful time that's going on. We've just gone back into lockdown. The schools are closing again here in Scotland, so we're facing lockdown 3. But we will come through, and I think we'll have to remake ourselves. We're going to have to rethink very carefully about our relationship with others and with contagion and with the natural world. I think we're going to have to ask ourselves as a population some very difficult questions. But we are going to come through it.
Okay, this is from Whitney. Oh Lord, I loved this book. I'd love to know about her research process, not quote, what sources did you use for your research, but more quote, how did you incorporate your research into this magnificent novel? Are you one of those writers who does all the research up front, then steps away from it while you write, or did you research as you went along? My favorite scene of the entire book was the scene in the Apple storeroom. By the way, if you want to read about Shakespeare having sex, this is the book for you. My favorite scene in the entire book was the scene in the Apple storeroom. How did your research inform such a sensual, evocative scene?
Well, there was quite a bit of pressure, because I knew I had to write a sex scene, and with Shakespeare, who, writes probably the greatest love poetry. So it was quite a lot of pressure. But I think in terms of research, I'm going to sidestep that actually, and I'm going to talk about research instead. I think the research I did a little bit. I mean, it's funny. I'm not very organized in kind of life or in writing. So I did some research, and then I would write a bit, and then I would go back to kind of check it. But I think the thing with research, particularly with historical novels, is you have to do it because you've got to know everything you can. You can't construct a scene between two people in a parlor in an Elizabethan house unless you know exactly. I found I couldn't do it unless I knew what the floor was made of, what the walls looked like, just what they were wearing. You need to know that. But actually, you have to shove about 98% of it out of your novel. Because if you write a novel where you shovel in all that research and you show all your workings and you make sure the reader knows you've done your homework, it's going to be the world's most boring book. So you have to wear it very lightly. You've got to know it, but then you've got to get rid of it in a sense.
Okay, next is a question from Kimberly, which is about the long gestation period for the book. And I think just to kind of paraphrase her question, you said you thought of this when you were at university, maybe 30 years ago or whatever it was, and you've been thinking about it since then. And so it just sort of begs the question, you knew you wanted to write a book about this. Why did you not write a book about it? Was the moment right? Did you have some false starts or?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I knew I wanted to write it for quite a long time, but every time, for quite a long time, there were sort of phases to it. And the first phase was, I think about it and I think, oh, come on, you can't possibly do that. Are you crazy? And then there was a kind of a sort of second phase where I'd think, oh, I can't do it. But also I was slightly superstitious about it because I have a son and two daughters like the Shakespeares did. And I found that I couldn't do it until my own son was past the age of 11, till he was quite safely. Not that there was a huge risk of him contracting the Black Death, but you never know. You can't be too careful. So I found that I would sort of think about it and then I would veer back because I knew that, obviously I was going to have to put myself inside the skin of a woman who sits at her child's bedside and is forced to watch him die. And I couldn't do that while my son was sort of still in the same age, because I knew that there would be parts of my son that would feed into Hamnet. And actually, it's true, there is quite a lot of my son in my version of Hamnet. So it was an odd superstition, I think, in a way. And then I did make a start after he's 17, by the way, and 6'2", so he's he's past the superstitious danger. And then I did make a start on it, but I kept veering off and writing another book. I think, I'll just put it away again. And I've written 3 books actually instead of writing Hamnet. And when I got back, I finished writing my memoir, and I kind of gave myself a talking to. I sat down, I said, okay, you either got to do this now, or you've got to forget about it. You can't just keep, flirting with the idea. And so I thought, I'll give it a go. And I looked back at the document that I had, and I had maybe about 20,000 words. And I realized it was all wrong, that I'd started the book in the wrong place, from the wrong point of view. Because actually I'd started it after Hamlet's death, and it was looking back retrospective. And it was all ridiculous. So I thought, no, I need to start with him. He is the heart of the book. It's got to be him. It's him. And the illness has entered the house. And bam, I was away. Somehow that kind of unlocked it.
Yeah. Okay, one more audience question very quickly. This is a question from Joe, who said, I heard you say in another interview that some days you think your writing is all worthwhile and some days you think it's just terrible and you want to give up on it. How do you navigate through that as a writer?
Well, actually, in a way, I think you need both. You need both of those days, in a way. I always think that the writing a book, it's writing anything, I would imagine, but certainly writing a novel happens in a kind of wave pattern like this. You need this kind of upswing of optimism where you think, yes, this is going well. This is what I want to be writing. I've hit my stride. And then where that will always be followed by a huge crash of confidence where you think everything is rubbish. I can't write a word. I need to find another job. I hate it all. But you need that you need the drop. to edit yourself, because that makes you go back over what you've done and think, well, this is rubbish, but actually that paragraph, there's something in that, or there's something in the idea. And then it will always be followed by a kind of, you think, oh great, I can do it, I've hit my stride again. And then you think, no, it's terrible. So, and it goes on and on like that. So as long as you know that that neither of those states is permanent, and that you need both, they're a kind of yin and yang of creativity, I think.
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so one more question from me and then we'll wrap. So Maggie, this has been awesome. I ask this question to all of our people who come on my show. So just imagine that you have an ideal reader for this book. This is somebody who is reading your book and sort of getting every reference you're making, understanding your characters inside and out, the way you want them to be understood, and so on. And this ideal reader gets to the end of Hamnet, closes the book. Just describe for me in a word or a phrase, what is the feeling that this reader would have at the end of your book?
I think if people wanted to go back and reread Hamlet, I'd be really pleased. People thought, oh God, I need to go and read it, or I need to watch it or see it. I'd be very happy if people return to it thinking about Hamnet the boy.
Mm-hmm. Awesome, awesome. That is great. I will say for myself that I felt sort of overpowered. I don't even know if I could put into words like the feeling that I have. Just the last line of your book, and buy this book, folks, read to that last line. It's worth it. That last line was just like, made me sit up straight in my chair. So anyway, what a triumph. What a great book. Maggie, could you hold up the book one more time?
Oh yeah. This is the UK one. Actually, you know what I've realized? It's actually the Swedish one. I just looked at it and thought it's not even UK when it's Swedish, but it's the same cover. So this is the Swedish Hamnet. I don't even know how it's Swedish.
All right, wonderful. Well, folks, please, please, please buy this book. Maggie O'Farrell, thank you so much for coming on The Thoughtful Bro. Congratulations on all the success. Folks, I'm taking 2 weeks off for The Thoughtful Bro. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another interview on January 12th. Everybody have a happy holiday. Buy Hamnet right now. Don't even think about it. If you already bought it, buy it again. Thank you. We'll see you guys soon.
Thank you so much.